Quote, "We were standing there looking at the scene and the phones kept ringing and ringing and ringing in the backpacks and on the desk of the parents calling their children. They kept calling and calling and calling."
Hello, and welcome to Nosotros, the podcast about San Antonio politics, history, cultura, y más. I'm your host, Elaine Ayala, Metro columnist for the San Antonio Express News. My guest today is Silvia Foster-Frau, who was on the investigative national reporting team at the Washington Post that just recently won a Pulitzer Prize for its landmark report that examined the impact and role of the assault rifle on American life. You might remember her byline when it was in the San Antonio Express News not too long ago. She covered the 2017 mass shooting at Sutherland Springs. Welcome and congratulations on your Pulitzer.
Thank you, Elaine. Thanks for having me.
The name of the Post's Pulitzer Prize winning report was American Icon. Mm-hmm. It was huge in so many ways. Tell us about the scope and what it set out to do.
Yeah, so the whole series really came about after the Uvalde mass shooting, which you guys got to know very intimately, being so close to the community, where at that point, our newsroom had covered so many shootings, and especially the team that I was on at the time, the America Desk, was constantly responding to mass shooting after mass shooting, and it started to seem very rote and routine. You always were kind of telling the same stories over and over again, and I think not only were we beginning to get numb to it, but also readers and people who are absorbing the information. I mean, at some point, it just started to feel like you're seeing the same story over again. And so we really started to talk as a newsroom about what could be done differently to really try to create change and understand why these keep happening again and again and again. And that was really the inception of the American Icon series, which looks at AR-15 style rifles and the destruction that they cause in mass shootings. So AR-15 style rifles are the most commonly used rifles in the deadliest mass shootings in the country. And so we sought to explore kind of through that lens how it is that they create this much damage and what that looks like on communities, including showing never before seen images shortly after mass shootings and telling the stories of communities years after their mass shootings, like how they are coping and still dealing with that tragedy.
Your stories were especially poignant, or maybe it was just me as a reader wanting to read more about Sutherland Springs and Uvalde and wanting to read more about what the weapon actually does. But I gave you a heads up that I really want you to go back to your stories and just pick out some excerpts that stood out to you, just a few that you might want to read aloud, and then maybe we could explore one or two of them.
Yeah, let me pull some of those up here. So first, there's a description here of AR-15s and how they affect a space and bodies, and then I'll follow that with a few quotes. So for this story in particular, which was Terror on Repeat, we took quotes from either interviews that we did ourselves or open records requests or transcripts from court hearings from people across 11 different shootings over the span of 11 years. And we put them together in the story to create the narrative of one mass shooting, interweaving voices from the span of 11 years and images and videos too. And I'll add to that, one of the eeriest things about the process of doing that, which took months, was seeing how descriptions from, for example, Sandy Hook matched almost verbatim what the images and descriptions were from Uvalde of children piled on top of each other in classrooms. It almost began to blur in our minds what images were from where and what descriptions were from where, because these shootings have so much in common, and these AR-15 shootings in particular cause a very specific and widespread amount of damage. So I'll start with that. So this is from Terror on Repeat. Bullets from AR-15s have blasted through classroom doors and walls. They have shredded theater seats and splintered wooden church pews. They have mangled human bodies and, in a matter of seconds, shattered the lives of people attending a concert, shopping on a Saturday afternoon, going out with friends and family, working in their offices, and worshiping at church and synagogue. They have killed first graders, teenagers, mothers, fathers, and grandparents. The AR-15, a weapon that has soared in popularity over the past 2 decades as a beloved tool for hunting, target practice, and self-defense, has also given assailants the power to instantly turn everyday American gathering places into zones of gruesome violence. Now for some of the quotes. Quote, "I saw my right arm get blown open in 2 places and my right hand. The pain was the worst pain I ever felt. I looked at it as I felt it, and it looked like shredded raw meat, and there was a lot of blood." That was Andrea Wedner, synagogue congregant from Pittsburgh. Quote, "I could hear a little girl say, 'Officers, come in, we're in here.' And she sounded so far away, so I knew it was the other room. And she said that once, and then maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, she said it again. And then I just heard him walk into that other room, and he shot some more. So after that, I didn't hear her no more, and so I figured he had killed her." That was Arnulfo Reyes, who's a teacher in Uvalde. Quote, "When you can tell the difference between, when somebody is alive and somebody is dead, it's because there were pieces of people just laying everywhere. And those were the dead ones." Rusty Duncan, volunteer firefighter, Sutherland Springs. Quote, "We were standing there looking at the scene, and the phones kept ringing and ringing and ringing in the backpacks and on the desk of the parents calling their children. They kept calling and calling and calling. Eulalio Diaz, Justice of the Peace and Corner from Uvalde." And so if you notice, too, a lot of these voices, it's people from completely different backgrounds, from different churches, different walks of life, different race, class, you name it. But they all live in America, and they all live in a country that has allowed this to happen for years.
And one that it was a startling statistic as I read one of the stories. I don't think it was yours, but that 1 in 20 gun owners have an assault rifle.
Yeah, it's also become a very revered weapon for people to have in their homes. It's been heavily marketed by the gun industry and has rose to popularity. It's very customizable, which people enjoy doing. They'll buy kind of different parts and add to it. And it's, for some folks, a collector's items. For other folks, used for hunting, for sportsmanship. It's become its own kind of cultural phenomenon at the same time.
And in a pretty short period of time, it's become the weapon of choice, not only for gun owners, but for mass murderers. What kind of response did you get after this series published? Especially the Second Amendment folks who probably didn't like to hear what some of these stories were saying.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, especially when the last story, Terror on Repeat, published, we were very nervous about how it would be received, because this piece really pushed the envelope over in terms of what we were willing to show to the public in graphic imagery. We showed images that had never been seen before from the Uvalde classroom, moments after bodies had been removed from the classroom where there was blood on the floor or body bags in hallways. And we spent a lot of time deliberating and even arguing sometimes in the newsroom about what we should show, how we should show it. Was it responsible to show it? We talked during the course of that time to advocates and victims' family members and used them also as sounding boards on gauging that level of what is appropriate to show, what could move the needle without harming the victims' family members or, at the risk of dehumanizing the people that are being depicted. And so throughout that entire process, we ended up where we are now. And then shortly before publication, we took the extra step to notify people from every single mass shooting community that was included in that story. So 11 different ones. We basically called everyone we knew and had ever spoken to alert them that the story was coming out. And that's not something that newsrooms usually do, right? Mm-hmm. You don't tell people ahead of time you're going to publish something. But we really felt like with the sensitivity of this story that we wanted to give the impacted and affected communities the opportunity to look away if it did cross their news feed. And we wanted to kind of empower them. In addition to all the kind of caveats and warnings that we have at the top of the page, we wanted to give them an even more reason to feel like they are empowered to not have to look at that. Because really, these stories are not for people who already intimately know what it's like to be in a mass shooting and what these weapons can do. It's really for everyone else who doesn't, right? For them to understand that. And so we kind of braced people, we hit publish, and then we kind of waited to see how people would respond. And we had thousands of reader comments. We ended up doing a story with just some of the comments that showed the range of perspectives that people had. Some folks still wanted to see more graphic imagery than what we showed. They said it's not enough. You need to show broken bodies to wake people up. Some people thought it was just right. Some people said they had to force themselves to get through it because they felt like they needed to see it, but they hated to see it. And other folks did feel like, that they wanted to emphasize the role that it plays in culture and that, there are obviously millions of gun owners who never commit mass shootings that are very responsible with their guns and keep them safe and, are completely sound of mind. And it's very important to keep those folks in mind too.
Some of the sentences, very short, declarative sentences were you just kind of had to gulp and move on. So I pulled out a quote too. And I think it's from the story called The Blast Effect, which may be the hardest one to read. It's the hardest one that I've read so far about the impact of bullets on bodies. The scenes of chaos and terror are all too familiar in America. The AR-15 fires bullets at such a high velocity, often in a barrage of 30 or even 100 in rapid succession, that it can eviscerate multiple people in seconds. A single bullet lands with a shockwave intense enough to blow apart a skull and demolish vital organs. The impact is even more acute on the compact body of a small child. The carnage is rarely visible to the public. And I know that when I've written about the issue of mass shootings, I'll get calls from people saying, you ought to do more. People need to really see it, to vote, to pass more gun laws. But as you told me earlier, even in Uvalde, there are very outspoken gun advocates.
Yeah, and in Sutherland Springs, too, one of the things I found interesting was that oftentimes, or many times, these tragedies don't necessarily change people's outlooks when it comes to the question of gun restrictions and background checks and all of these kind of debates that we are having today. In some cases, it will fortify their own opinion, whatever that is, which I find kind of really fascinating psychologically. And also, I think just goes to show like the many different ways that you can process experiences that happen to you.
And that Sutherland Springs has 2 or 3 people in their church services all the time that are armed.
Yeah, the Sutherland Springs folks put a lot of money and time into creating a security team. They have a new church building now that is fortified. Its windows are raised above, so if someone tried to shoot through the windows, it would never hit a person. Cameras, a whole security team, people come armed. Yeah, it's a very different church than the small kind of quaint church they had before.
What do you hope the impact of the series will be post-Pulitzer now?
Well, I do think one of the benefits of these stories winning awards can be that it brings more attention to them. And one of my colleagues mentioned that these stories had a boost in readership after the Pulitzers were announced because people were going to see what was this kind of award-winning work. And that's really the most I can hope for, is that more people will read these and understand both what AR-15 style rifles are capable of, and also have a deeper understanding of what these communities are going through years after the tragedy. As you mentioned, Sutherland Springs, for one of the stories, I went back there more than 5 years after their shooting took place. And I had a special relationship with them because of my time at the San Antonio Express-News, because that story broke when I was working here, and I got to know the community very well through that coverage. And I'm very grateful that the paper took the time and resources to let me cover them, not just in the first few days when they were making national news and people were flying in from the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN, but also for weeks and months after, when the national media had left and I stayed covering them. And so I had built a very close bond with them and a lot of trust. They saw that my reporting always was accurate and fair to them. And so with the Washington Post, I was able to go back years later and document what was still happening with them in their community. And I think that so rarely do we get the opportunity to do that, but I think it's so important for people to realize that though the news cycle moves on, these communities are still going through it. Mm-hmm. And in Sutherland Springs, you have people who have fragments from shards of bullets and shrapnel all over their body that leaches lead into them. And they're suffering currently from lead toxicity and lead poisoning. And that's caused a host of health issues, including for one of the women, infertility. She can no longer have a child. And then there's the mental emotional toll, right? John Holcomb lost 9 members of his family, including his pregnant wife,
I can't
3
imagine.
of his children, his 2 parents, his brother, his brother's child. I mean, imagine that extent of loss. That affects you for the rest of your life. And there are communities like that, increasing numbers of them across America, that will have to be dealing with this and coping with the outfall of the tragedy forever.
I was struck especially by the lead of that story where you mention freckles on a young girl's face, but it's freckles from the lead.
Yeah, they're purple. If you look closely, they're not the color of normal freckles, and it's microscopic pieces of lead that you can't just kind of take out. And imagine that in your organs, all over your body. Yeah,
and the pain. Not just physical, which the story was very clear about how many medications. So I think one was taking 30 medications a day, or that one man was popping ibuprofen multiple times a day and still living with pain, but the emotional pain, the psychological pain, loud noises, just any time people are together in one spot, how they can just spiral back to that moment. You are a young journalist. You're going to turn 31 soon, or you already are 31?
I am 31.
Okay. What's next for you after the Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm not sure. I mean, I'm going to keep doing stories that I love to do, and I have a job that lets me do them, and it pays the bills at the same time. So I think I'm going to keep doing that. I loved what I loved about this series is that it was not a conventional storytelling methods, right? We got very creative, and we pushed the envelope in a lot of ways of what traditional journalism has been. And I really hope to continue doing more of that work, because I think it allows more people to understand our work in different ways. And I think it's always important to kind of challenge and question the traditions we have in place as people in news media, and make sure that and revise and constantly challenge kind of the things we have in place in the hopes of telling a better story.
And you have to mention that you're one of the founding members of an organization that was created out of this kind of tragedy. Is it still active?
Yeah. So it was shortly after the Sutherland Springs mass shooting that we received a care package from the Orlando Sentinel, from the folks who had to cover the Pulse mass shooting not too long before. And there was kind of this informal network where newsrooms would donate care packages, send them to other newsrooms who were going through what they had recently experienced in having to cover a mass shooting, because especially in a local newsroom, everyone's covering it when that happens in your backyard.
All hands on deck.
Yeah. And I was so incredibly touched by that I connected with a reporter from Orlando, and we decided to form a group on Facebook called Journalists Covering Trauma to try to help unite all of us, this growing number of journalists who have had to cover mass shootings and other really horrible tragedies again and again in this country, and offer resources and in general just help raise more awareness about the mental health toll that it takes for us as journalists. We're often the first responders, or a type of first responder on the scene in these shootings, but we're not folks like police or EMS who have had a background in training and dealing with seeing what we see and absorbing what we have to absorb. And so we felt like it was really important to kind of help each other out in that way and help kind of raise awareness about the issue.
And the Post, in fact, did some training of its own before you embarked on reporting this mass story, this huge story.
Yes, before we did Terror on Repeat, and we knew that we would be immersing ourselves in thousands of images and videos, some that were still so graphic we never ended up publishing them. We did a training with the Dart Center, which specializes with journalism and trauma, and they kind of walked us through a few kind of tips for how to absorb that information and not let it affect you, but ways to cope with that. One of the key takeaways that we really stuck to during that time was always going in with a clear vision or mission. Because if you don't have an idea of what exactly you're looking for, you can end up getting lost and viewing really horrific images and taking that all in without having kind of almost like a filter in your mind of what exactly you're looking for to help you stay away a little bit from like the horrors of what you're seeing. And so that was really helpful. And that was something like me and my colleague, Nick Kirkpatrick, we would sit together and like say, okay, what are we looking for in this trove of files? And how can we stick to that and kind of keep ourselves both accountable to doing that throughout the process?
I'm glad to see that you'll be doing other kinds of stories that you love to do and traipsing around the country to cover them. I wouldn't be doing justice to my chismosa tradition if I let you get away without talking a little bit about one of San Antonio's favorite sons, a former mayor, and don't look at me like you don't know what you're talking about. And a former member of the Obama cabinet. And how are y'all doing?
We're good. Yeah. He's in New York right now, Julian. So he couldn't be here. But it's been great.
Yeah, we are talking about Julian Castro,
right,
who you are in a relationship with. And it's been beautiful to see your pictures over a couple of months now. And so thanks for stopping in. And please tell Julian he's always welcome at this desk.
I will. Thank you, Elaine.
Please share this twice-a-month podcast with your friends. I'd love to have more listeners. The video version of Nosotros can be found on YouTube, but you can listen into this podcast wherever you find yours, and it's always on the expressnews.com website under the tab that says podcasts. My Metro column appears every Wednesday and Friday in the Express News, and my email address is eayala@express-news.net. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.